The most recent Brawl Stars update has completely changed the meta. Seriously, some of the worst brawlers in the game are now some of the best. And we're going to rank every brawler from worst to best. Wanted to give a huge thank you to the pro players right here for making this tier list as accurate as possible, with the exception of one brand new brawler, Clancy, which the pros have not played as much as I have. None of what you're about to see is my opinion. This is the pro opinion. Starting us off at the very bottom of the F tier is Doug. Doug didn't receive any balance changes, and because of Frank's rework, he is now the worst brawler in the game. Next, we have Penny moving from the D tier down into the F tier. Penny didn't get nerfed or anything like that, but she has been struggling to keep up with the meta the last few updates simply because her stats are low. And now that Frank's moved up, there's a little bit more room in the F tier for her. Also moving from the D tier down to the F tier is Janet. Janet has very underwhelming stats despite getting a buff to her damage, and she particularly struggles against aggressive brawlers, which are at the top of the meta right now. She just doesn't have burst damage. Daryl is moving from the C tier down into the F tier. He is one of the only tanks in the game that does not have a hypercharge and hasn't had any buffs to compensate for that, so there's not really much of a reason to use him right now. He just gets shut down. Next, we have the D tier brawlers. These brawlers are also not competitive, but they're not quite as bad as the F tier brawlers. The D stands for don't play them. I decided that just now. We got Hank moving from the F tier up into the D tier. Hank received another buff to his health this update, and while he's still far below average, he's actually sort of useful, kind of, in some cases, a little bit. Grom is moving from the C tier down into the F tier. He didn't receive any changes. He's just been power crept on pretty much every other thrower in the game right now, especially with Barry being in the game now. Next is Bo, moving from the C tier down to the D tier. There are enough hypercharges in the game now that if a brawler does not have a hypercharge, they have to be really good in order to still be played, and Bo is one of those brawlers that just is not strong enough. Bonnie's moving from B tier down to the D tier. She's another brawler, did not get a buff or a hypercharge, and she particularly fell off because of certain brawlers that moved up in the meta that she struggles against. Gus is moving from the C tier down into the D tier. Similar to Penny and Janet, Gus really just doesn't have a bad kit. His stats are just too weak right now, especially because so many brawlers in the game now have hypercharges. Mr. P is moving from the B tier down into the D tier, skipping the C tier. Oh, that hurts. No changes were made to Mr. P. He just has low stats, no abilities that are good for dealing with aggressive brawlers, and we're seeing a lot of aggressive brawlers right now. Mortis is moving from the C tier down into the D tier. The more tanks and assassins that get hypercharges, the worse Mortis gets as long as he does not get a hypercharge or some sort of buff. Squeak is going from the C tier down into the D tier. Like Mr. P, as soon as an aggressive brawler gets close enough to Squeak, there's nothing that he can do to get them away, so he's really struggling right now. Okay, now we have these C tier brawlers. These ones are also not competitive. They're just not as bad as the D tier and F tier brawlers. You can play them though, just might struggle a little bit compared to some of the better ones. First up is Ash, moving from the B tier down to the C tier. He's another tank who just does not have enough reasons to be played without a hypercharge right now. Bull is staying in the C tier. He's the first brawler on this list that actually does have a hypercharge, but too many of his counters are just getting their hypercharges, so he's back down to being a little bit below average. Remember when Bull was actually good? That was fun. Pearl's moving from the B tier down into the C tier. Pearl also has a hypercharge, but her hypercharge ability is probably the worst one in the game. Also, she's pretty underwhelming in this meta. Carl's moving from the B tier down into the C tier. So sad. Lots of brawlers with knockbacks and stuns are moving up in this current meta right now, which naturally brings Carl down because it just renders his super fairly useless. Edgar is staying in the C tier. He had a good run when he was one of the only brawlers in the game with a hypercharge, but now he's slowly going back to being the old Edgar that easily gets countered by a lot of brawlers, at least in the competitive meta. Next, we have Maisie, who is moving from the D tier up into the C tier. Maisie actually got a slight buff to her supercharge rate, but even more importantly, she's actually a pretty good brawler against aggressive brawlers, so she's a little bit better than before. Still not quite competitive though. Now, Tara is actually staying in the C tier. She's also a good brawler against aggressive brawlers, and even though she's not going to be your first choice, she's at least usable even without a hypercharge. Miko is also staying in the C tier. He's a lot like Mortis in the sense that he's really good against certain brawlers and just terrible against other brawlers. Right now, he's just too inconsistent to be played a lot competitively. El Primo is moving from the B tier down into the C tier. Nothing changed for El Primo, but there are just better options to choose from right now as far as close range aggressive brawlers go. Leon is moving from the B tier down into the C tier. The main reason Leon isn't being used as much anymore is simply because a lot of brawlers that he's really good against have actually gotten a lot better. So he struggles a little bit more against them now. Now let's talk about the B tier brawlers. These brawlers are competitive, but usually they're played to be specific counters or to play with specific brawlers or on specific maps and modes. In other words, they're not typically your go-to pick for everything. Starting us off, we have Sprout moving from the A tier to the bottom of the B tier. For the first time in a long time, even on Sprout's best maps, it still has a tough time dealing with all these aggressive brawlers that have ways of playing around its super. Otis is staying in the B tier. Otis actually plays really good against aggressive brawlers, but he just does not have the stats to be a top brawler right now. I think think he'll be way better once he gets a hypercharge, but who knows when that will be. Next, we have Spike in the B tier. I still think it's crazy he's not in the S tier. Nothing changed for Spike this update, and ever since his attack damage got nerfed, he's been average. Shelly is staying in the B tier. She is a good counter to lots of aggressive brawlers, but she also gets outranged very easily, so she's not the best tank counter in the game right now. Rosa is also staying in the B tier. She is a decent tank, but lots of the top brawlers right now have abilities that can keep enemies away from them, which is one of Rosa's biggest weaknesses. If she gets close, she's gonna kill you. But obviously, if she can't touch you, well, then you're gonna do just fine. Nani is moving from the A tier down into the B tier. Nani has been one of the best long-range brawlers in the game for a while, but now she's kind of getting power crept on by other long-range brawlers that are getting their hypercharges. Piper! Sorry, I don't know what that was. Fang is moving from the C tier up into the B tier. Fang is not the best assassin in the game right now, but he is one of the aggro brawlers that has performed a little bit better in this meta. Eve is staying in the B tier. Eve was slightly better last update because her spawners were good counters to lots of the top brawlers, but that's no longer the case, so she's not getting upgraded here. Brock is staying in the B tier. Brock actually did get a buff to his hypercharge and super damage, but because it was actually worse than his regular super before, this actually hasn't made much of a difference for him. His biggest issue right now is that his shots are just a little bit too easy to dodge for a lot of brawlers. BB is staying in the B tier. BB is a solid close range brawler right now, but she also gets countered pretty easily, and like other tanks that I've already mentioned, there are just better options right now. Jackie is staying in the B tier. No changes were made to Jackie, and just like BB, she's a decent tank, but nowhere near the best at the moment. Lola is staying in the B tier. She didn't receive any balance changes either, and I'd say she's like the most average balanced brawler in the game right now. B is moving from the C tier up into the B tier. She didn't get any balance changes, but she's a really solid brawler against aggro brawlers, and she's always been at least decent, so she's definitely playable in this meta right now. Chuck is staying in the B tier. He is a very inconsistent brawler since he's pretty much only playable on like certain maps and modes, but the maps and modes that he can be used on, he is one of the best brawlers to use. I love playing him in Heist so much. Griff is staying in the B tier. He is another brawler that has managed to remain a decent brawler despite not having a hypercharge. He deals so much damage at close range, and he's actually slightly better in this meta. Personally, I'm playing Griff all the time. He might not be more than B tier competitively, but like in the mid tier, I would say he's S tier. I just destroy with him, and it's so good. Colt is staying in the B tier. Similar to Edgar, Colt was one of the best brawlers when most other brawlers didn't have a hypercharge. So he's been slowly dropping through the meta as other brawlers get hypercharges, but he's always been usable if you have really good aim. Like, good Colt players are really annoying to deal with. Lou is moving from the C tier up into the B tier. Some of these strongest brawlers right now are very hard to play against Lou, so he's being used a little bit more in this update. The fact that his hypercharge super and just his super can do such a good job at stopping other brawler hypercharges is really useful, even if it's not as effective as like Cordelius is at like just completely shutting people's hypercharges down. Sam is staying in the B tier. No changes were made to Sam, and even though the meta has changed quite a bit, he seems to be right where he was last update. Ems is staying in the B tier. She is the first brawler on this list that got a new hypercharge this update. Now, while she is being played a lot more now, it seems to have only made her slightly better than before. Pam is staying in the B tier. Support brawlers don't typically fall down the meta, even if they're not the best, simply because helping the top brawlers on your team is usually good enough. So Pam is still definitely playable, even if there might be support brawlers that are better. Barry! It's something stuck in my throat. It's ice cream. 8-Bit is staying in the B tier. 8-Bit is also good for powering up his teammates with his super, and because he's good at playing against aggressive brawlers, he's actually slightly better than before. He's a little bit slow, but as long as there's open spaces, 8-Bit's pretty tough to deal with. Poco is moving from the A tier down into the B tier. While Poco is a support brawler like Pam, he is a lot worse at dealing with brawlers that are right next to him than he was before, so he's actually significantly weaker than before. Willow is moving from the C tier up into the B tier. Whoa, that's a big change for her. Even though no changes were made to Willow, her super by itself is good enough right now to make her a decent brawler in the meta. As soon as somebody goes and uses a hypercharge, she just plops it on them. They can't do anything. Like, it's a wasted hypercharge, so she's useful. Dynamite is staying in the B tier. He can deal some insane damage, but his shots can be very hard to land against fast-moving brawlers, so he seems to be gradually falling down the tier list. Stu is moving from the A tier down into the B tier. Stu is getting power crept on without a hypercharge, but he's always been good, so I'm sure that he'll be back at the top as soon as he gets one. I have no idea what his hypercharge is going to be, but it could be a nightmare. Ruffs is moving from the A tier down into the B tier. Ruffs has finally gotten to the point where his stats are so weak that even his super powering up good brawlers isn't worth having Ruffs on your team. at least not as much as it was before. I used to say that Ruffs was always good because he's always going to help the top brawlers, but he's just a little bit more of a liability. Surge is moving from the C tier up into the B tier. Surge has really struggled in the past, but this might be one of his best metas yet, since his biggest problem is charging his first super, and he does that pretty easily against aggressive brawlers. Mandy is moving from the D tier, skipping the C tier, and making her way up to near the top of the B tier. She got a considerable buff to her supercharge rate, and even though she's still not one of the best brawlers, she's way better than she was before. Gray is moving from the A tier down into the B tier. Similar to Ruffs, the effect that Gray's super has on his teammates is mostly what has made him so good, but right now, it's just not needed as much because you have some brawlers that can clear the gap without his portal. Tick is staying in the B tier and is actually at the very top of the B tier. Tick has been a lot stronger since he got a hypercharge, and even though throwers are generally worse in aggressive metas, his super and gadget do a decent job at keeping enemies away from him. Okay, now let's talk about the A tier brawlers. These brawlers are very competitive, usually in a lot more modes than the B tiers. They're just not quite as good as the S tier brawlers. Lily. Gale's moving from the B tier up into the A tier. His new hypercharge has proven to actually be really good, and it can easily be debated that he should be higher up on this list because of how well he counters the current meta. Chester is moving from the C tier all the way up into the A tier. Chester had a pretty major rework, which honestly was just a massive big buff. He was already a great brawler for countering aggressive brawlers before the rework, so now he's even better. Crow is moving from the C tier up into the A tier. And for the third aggro counter in a row, Crow has been played a lot more recently, even though he didn't get any balance changes. Belle is moving from the S tier down into the A tier. In the last meta, Belle was the go-to sharpshooter, but with Angelo and Piper getting their hypercharges, she's not being used quite as much as before. RT is staying in the A tier. Now, RT is just an average brawler while he's in his normal form, but because of the insane damage that he can deal while split, he's a very strong counter to close range brawlers. Now that he has a gadget that allows him to always charge a super and get back to long range, he's a lot better than he was before. Granted, that change actually happened like last meta. Rico is staying in the A tier. Rico received his hypercharge this update, but also got a nerf to his gadget, so he's actually only slightly better than he was before. Clancy is starting out in the A tier. Now, this is the one placement that is not pro speculation, it's just my own speculation. He's not been released at this time that I've recorded this, so I've only played him against bots. That being said, he can deal some of the most insane damage in the game, and his range honestly even isn't that bad. Honestly, I cannot put him anywhere below A tier right now. There is a very good chance that he is absolutely going to be S tier, but I like to be a little bit hesitant to just put him out there right now. We'll have to see as time plays out. Jessie is staying in the A tier. Jessie's still a really good brawler, but she's not one of the best anymore simply because she doesn't deal enough damage to deal with so many tanks. I'm still really enjoying playing her in Heist though. Barley, surprisingly, has moved from the B tier up into the A tier. Barley's new hypercharge was all he needed to instantly become one of the best throwers in the game, and he outranges Barry, who is one of the best brawlers in the game, and that does give you a reason to play him. Draco is moving from the B tier up into the A tier. Now, my last tier list, Draco had not been released, and guess what? The developers actually significantly buffed him from when I placed him to when he was released. And he ended up being completely broken, arguably the best brawler in the game. Since then though, he's been nerfed a couple of times. He's still a really good tank though. I just had to let you guys know why I had him in the B tier in the first place, because he was not good until that feedback was shared with the developers, and then they buffed him to make him actually decent, because he wouldn't have been as fun, I promise guys. And boy was he fun. Not to play against though. That was awful. Buzz is moving from the B tier up into the A tier. Buzz didn't get any balance changes, but he's doing so well in this meta, not because he's a close range brawler himself, but he also plays really well into other close range brawlers. Buster is staying in the A tier. Buster is easily one of the best brawlers in the game that does not have a hypercharge. His super is just so good, and I feel like he's gonna have to have some kind of a nerf before he gets his hypercharge, or he's just gonna break the game. Larry and Laurie are moving from the B tier up into the A tier. Larry and Laurie are also really good for not having received a hypercharge yet. Larry by himself can honestly deal plenty of damage up close or far away, and once you get Laurie out, then you just can't go near Larry. He also outranges Barry, which is something to consider right now because Barry's very strong. Ice Cream is just really strong. Charlie is moving from the S tier down into the A tier. After several updates, Charlie is finally out of the S tier, but she is still a very good brawler. Her super is easily one of the best in the game, especially at countering hypercharges, but her stats have been lowered so many times that she just isn't completely broken anymore. Melody is moving from the S tier down into the A tier. She got another nerf this update to her health, and while she's still far above average, this nerf just was enough to push her out of the S tier. Gene is moving from the S tier down into the A tier. No changes were made to Gene this update, and he really didn't get that much worse, but there are just too many broken brawlers in the game right now that he just doesn't belong in the S tier. Colette is staying in the A tier. Colette also did not receive any balance changes this meta, and she's not really that much better than a lot of the A tier brawlers, but she's just so good at countering a lot of the S tier brawlers right now, and that is what is keeping her in the A tier. Piper is staying in the A tier. Piper was already in the A tier before her hypercharge, and even though the meta doesn't really favor her right now, she's definitely better than she was before. Max is moving from the S tier down into the A tier. Max is one of the best brawlers to support aggressive brawlers, but she herself just doesn't have the stats to be an S tier brawler for the time being. Amber is staying in the A tier. She's probably the safest brawler to pick in draft right now. She doesn't really have any weaknesses, and her damage output is still insane. She's also really easy to use. Auto aim for the win with Amber. Cordelius is staying in the A tier. He's doing slightly better in this meta because he counters aggressive brawlers very well, and he himself is one. So this meta is pretty much made for him. Nita is staying in the A tier. Nita's range is the only thing that is keeping her out of the S tier because her hypercharged bear is absolutely overwhelming no matter what gadget or star power she's using. It's just so much HP and it just chases you down. You got to deal with it. Angelo is moving from the S tier down into the A tier. Now, while Angelo did receive his hypercharge this update, he also got nerfed a decent amount, and the hypercharge has not proved to make up for that nerf. So he's actually a little bit worse than before. Also, his hypercharge charge rate actually got a buff. Still though, being near the top of the A tier is very good for Angelo. Next is Byron, moving from the S tier down into the A tier. Byron is still one of the best healers in the game, and he's honestly really hard to counter. So even though he's not the strongest brawler himself, you can't really ever go wrong using him unless you suck with him. Then you can go wrong using him. Okay, now we have the S tier brawlers. The S tier is reserved for the brawlers that are just so good that they're pretty much always useful, at least competitively, by competitive players. Keep in mind though that there are 3 brawlers that are undeniably just ridiculously strong. In fact, I probably should make an SSS tier. I'm not going to do that though. We'll talk about those 3 top brawlers in a minute. For now though, we have Kit moving from the A tier to the bottom of the S tier. Kit is significantly better in this meta because when he hops onto the back of some of the strongest brawlers, they are very hard to take down because he constantly heals them. On top of that, Kit actually deals a lot of damage by himself and has really good mobility. I don't know about you guys. Maybe some of you guys are confused about this placement because I personally suck very much with Kit because I play him as an aggressive brawler. In case you forgot, he's a support brawler. Play him like a support brawler. At least that's what the pros tell me. Sandy is staying in the S tier. Sandy's hypercharge rate had to be nerfed this update, and while that definitely slowed him down a bit, his hypercharge super is still unquestionably the best in the game, particularly for this meta at least. Next, we have Barry starting out in the S tier. This is Barry's first tier list, and he might be kind of broken, mostly because of how much he can heal. His attack and super stay on the battlefield for so long, and being able to have an AoE healing ability is just so strong. He's basically throwing Pam supers wherever he wants, whenever he wants, and pro players that know exactly how to utilize him are insane with him. They make him look like a monster. But now let's talk about the top 3 brawlers that are completely ruling the meta right now. Kicking us off, we have Frank, who is moving from the very bottom of the F tier all the way up into being the 3rd best brawler in the game. Ken would be very proud. Frank not only received his hypercharge this update, but he also received a rework that might have changed his abilities forever. He already had to have an emergency nerf since the update, and there's no way that he's not going to be nerfed more, because right now, even now after the nerf, he's still very broken. And I'm actually okay with this because Frank was at the bottom of the tier list for years, like so long. I've reused that Frank picture on my thumbnail so many times as the worst brawler because he's so bad. In fact, sometimes I just picked another bad brawler instead of Frank because I didn't want to use the same picture about Frank over and over and over again. He deserves some time to shine, even if he is just obliterating the meta. And I'm a little thankful that Supercell's on vacation right now, and we've got at least 1 month of Frank reigning supreme. Our next broken brawler is Meg, moving from the A tier up into the S tier. She was already so good before. Why did they make her so much stronger? Meg also received a major rework, and I actually think she is the most reworked brawler in the game, okay? This rework, like many in the past, has made her damage output ridiculous. She is totally broken right now, so I would expect some nerfs from her for her as well. This one, I'm less excited about her being super broken for at least 1 month, but yeah, she's really good. Next, we have Lily, who is moving from the C tier and going all the way up to the very, very top of the S tier. Lily received a huge buff. She basically got her attack potential doubled, right? And out of the few broken brawlers we have right now, Lily is probably the best. Between Frank, Meg, and Lily, there's a little bit of like, pros will disagree a little bit, but they are undeniably super strong. With her Shadow Realm gadget, there is really no great way of protecting yourself from her, and she probably has some of the fastest unload speed in the game. She also has had an emergency nerf, but it was pretty small, so I would absolutely expect more in the future. Before I show the final tier list, once again, a huge thank you to the pro players who helped make this. I did not have any input on here except for Clancy. I had a semi-pro player take the feedback from all of the pro players and put it into this, so you know that this is as accurate as possible for the competitive meta. They have worked very hard together to make this. I'm gonna smile for you guys. Feel free to share this, and if you do, don't crop my face out, please. Also, I would appreciate you guys supporting me with using code Kairos in the Brawl Stars shop. Kairos, code Kairos in the Brawl Stars shop. Supporting your favorite tier list ever. Probably spends is pretty good too.